What's up YouTube, I'm Guy, and today we are going to be checking out what I have here in this box. It is the new Rolex Submariner, a watch that I have been dying to get my hands on and of course to do a video review of. And yeah, I cannot wait. Still totally boxed up here. I have not seen it yet. And there's two reasons why. Number one, because I wanted to share my absolute first experience of seeing this watch with you guys. And number two, to let you know that this watch is actually on loan from my friends at David SW. And if you ever decide to buy a watch from David SW, I wanted to show you what the experience is like of getting a watch from them. So we're gonna dive into this, unbox it, and check it out for the first time together. Now, while I am carving into this box, let me take just a moment to thank David SW for sending this watch over to me on loan for the review. David SW has been a sponsor and supporter of my channel for a while now, and I approached them and I asked them for their support because I have personally done business with them in the past, and they are a dealer that I know I can trust and one that I can recommend to you guys based on my personal experience with them. David SW is an independent watch dealer of brands such as Rolex, Tudor, Omega, AP Patek, and more. So if you're looking to buy a new watch, I do not hesitate to recommend you visit their website, davidsw.com, or go to their store in Orlando, Florida, and talk to one of the members of the DSW team. I really can't recommend them enough. Well, here it is, the moment of truth, the new Rolex Submariner 126610LN. And it's not bad. Well, first impression, not too different from the old Submariner. You know, pulling it out of the box here, it's almost like it's the same watch. But then you pick up the old one and you set them side by side, and yes, you definitely see a big difference between the cases on these two watches. I'm not gonna lie, I really do like the new one. Do I like it better than my original ceramic Submariner, I guess is what we'll call this? Hard to say yet. I've only had them both in my hands here for less than a minute now, but very distinct difference between these two watches when you're sitting here looking at them side by side. So let's jump into the review. Let's take a close look at the new watch. We're going to talk about all of the specifications. I'm going to do just a basic review. Then later on in the video, we're going to compare these two. I'm going to tell you what I think the pros and the cons are both. If you're somebody that owns one of the older ones, should you maybe sell it and try to get your hands on a newer one? Or should you just sit tight with the one that you already have? I'm not sure what I want to do at this point yet, but hopefully by the end of this video we figure it out. So first things first, let's take a look at the new Rolex Submariner reference number 126610LN, and right off the bat, it looks great. But I wasn't expecting anything less. Now, it's not exactly a surprise to a lot of you guys watching that I'm a big fan of the Submariner. I've owned my 116610 for going on 4 years now, and it has been my favorite watch. So even with the changes and updates made to this model, I wasn't expecting to be disappointed. I kind of knew I was going to like it. Now, speaking of changes and updates, the big three changes to this model include, in no particular order, an updated and new movement powering the watch, a modification to the size and the profile of the watch's oyster case, and a change to the size of the bracelet. So let's talk about the case and the bracelet first and go over the features and specifications of the watch. Now, in terms of the size and the dimensions of this watch, the case comes in at 41 millimeters in diameter with an overall thickness of about 12.5 millimeters. And we have a wingspan of 48 millimeters from the outer lug to lug extremities. And of course, between the lugs where the bracelet attaches to the case, it measures in at 21 millimeters. Now, bear in mind, I don't have a high precision digital caliper, so if you're looking for measurements down to the 1/10 of a millimeter, these numbers might be a bit off ever so slightly, but it's close enough for me if I'm being honest. One of the other measurements to touch on is, of course, the bracelet taper, which starts at, of course, 21 millimeters wide at the end link, and it tapers down to 16 millimeters at the last link on the bracelet. Then the clasp steps up to about 18.5 millimeters in width. And we will talk about how this compares to the older model later in the video, but there are a number of differences here. As for the rest of the watch specifications, you get the great 904L oyster steel monoblock midcase with screw-down caseback and trip-lock screw-down Rolex signed crown. The case finishing is in a mix of high-polished flanks with satin-brushed finishing on the tops of the case lugs. All of this gives us 300 meters of waterproofness and one heck of a durable timepiece. The watch face is capped with a sapphire crystal sporting a Cyclops magnifier lens over the date complication. You have a 120-click unidirectional elapsed time bezel. The bezel insert is 60-minute graduated Cerachrome ceramic bezel insert with platinum-filled graduations, and of course a sapphire-capped and loomed pip at the 0 marker. The bracelet is a 3-piece link 904L oyster steel bracelet, riding on solid T-shaped end links, and it terminates into the folding oyster lock safety clasp, which includes the Rolex toolless adjustable glide lock extension system. The dial is a gloss black dial with white gold applied markers filled with blue chromolite glow-in-the-dark lume. The Mercedes-style handset Rolex is known for is high-polished white gold as well, and also filled with the same chromolite lume as the dial markers. The rest of the dial is printed in white, including the Rolex branding, subtext, and the 60-minute chapter ring at the edge of the dial. Now surrounding the dial is the Rolex engraved rehaut, which features the Rolex crown at the noon position and the watch's unique serial number down on the 6 o'clock side of the rehaut. The watch movement is of course one of the new 3200 generation movements, the caliber 3235, and features the new Rolex Chronergy escapement and a new monoblock self-winding rotor on ball bearings. The movement has a 70-hour power reserve, it runs at 28,800 vibrations per hour, uses an anti-magnetic blue parachrome hairspring, and has Paraflex shock absorbers. As a superlative chronometer, it is regulated in 6 positions to run at a rate between -2 and +2 seconds per day. I'd also note that I've heard reports that the new self-winding rotor is loud on the new movement. Someone described it as sounding like a cement mixer, and while I can report that the rotor on this watch is audible, more so even than the rotor on my watch with the 3135 movement, I certainly wouldn't say it sounds like a cement mixer, and I can only hear it if I hold the watch right up to my ear and give it a little bit of a jiggle. The screw-down case back is traditional Rolex with no engraving, branding, display window, or decoration. Honestly, there's not much else to say about that. The Submariner comes in several variations, both in steel, like the example here, and precious metals, and the price ranges from about $8,100 for the standard Submariner with no date up to $36,650 for the white gold blue bezel Smurf model. This Submariner Date has a retail price of $9,150, and that's a price increase of $600 over the previous generation model, which had a suggested retail price of $8,550. So that's the basic overview of the features and the specifications for the new current generation Rolex Submariner. Next, we're going to cover some of my thoughts on the history of the watch, quality and design, and we're going to drill down into some of the specifics and talk about some of the key features in a bit more detail. As I'm sure most of you already know, the legend of the Rolex Submariner started its life with the first models developed in 1953 and brought to market in 54 with the 6200 series models. Now those early models were in a smaller diameter watch case, more contemporary for the time, and it wasn't until the late 50s and early 1960s that the watch grew into the more traditional 40mm case size that we've come to know. Of course, one of those watches, the reference 5513, was in production from 1962 through 1989, nearly 30 years. In 1966, we saw the reference 1680, the first Submariner with a date complication, and the now iconic Cyclops magnifier. This model year watch is also known for having the word Submariner in a red line of text on the dial, and of course, it is highly collected. Now, the late 1960s also brought us the first Submariner in gold, having only been available in stainless steel previously, and perhaps could be viewed as one of the first steps towards dive watches being worn as more than just a tool to be used by divers. By the late 1970s and early 80s, we started to see what I'd call the modern Submariner models, including the transitional 16800 model and then the 5-digit pre-ceramic 16610 sub-date and its no-date counterpart. It was several decades before the watch changed again to the model known as the Ceramic Submariner, the first of which came to market in 2010, and that of course leads us to today and the current generation Submariner that we have here. The current model Submariner we have here obviously has its design philosophy rooted in the traditions of the watches that came before it, and when you look at any model Submariner, it's clear that they are from the same family of watches with small, incremental changes over time to improve both in quality and functionality, as well as keep up with the current trends in style and design. It's one of the things that people who love the Submariner like about the watch. The design is classic because it's largely unchanged from era to era. This is something that I could knock on a watch like the Omega Seamaster, which, don't get me wrong, is a great watch and one that I really love, but it's clear that over the decades the Submariner has followed a clearer path in design, making it more recognizable from one generation to the next. And so, like the watches that came before it, this model Submariner is largely unchanged as well, and we see evidence of that when we drill in and take a closer look at some of the specific features a little more. When we look at things like the dial and the bezel, there are only the most subtle changes that might go entirely unnoticed. And speaking of the bezel, on this model, like its predecessor, it's about as close to perfect as a dive bezel can be. Its 120-click ratcheting action is smooth and crisp, not too tight, with little to no slop or backplay. The high-gloss bezel insert and its scratch-proof and fade-resistant ceramic construction is executed to near perfection. The edge texture of the bezel assembly has a bite that gives a reassuring grip as you operate it and set the zero marker in position. It's, in my opinion, the best bezel I've come across, and it has been for more than a decade on the previous generation watches as well. The crown on this watch is similar to the bezel. It's executed to near perfection. The crown texture is sharp and crisp, making it easy to work with. The screw-down threading action is smooth, and hand-winding the watch movement feels like the same Rolex quality that I've come to know from owning and handling these watches over the years. Now, the 32-35 movement is of course hacking, with stop seconds when you pull the crown all the way out, and you can set the crown to the secondary position to quick set the date. Beneath the scratch-resistant sapphire crystal, you find the classic Rolex Mercedes handset and the Rolex Submariner dial, two design staples of the watch and the brand that have only had slight changes for more than 50 years. And I know the Mercedes handset can be a bit divisive. People tend to either love them or hate them, but regardless of which camp you're in, they are quintessential Rolex designs. The dial markers are applied to the dial and outlined in white gold as well. And they are set up featuring an inverse triangle at 12 with baton markers at 6 and 9, filled out with circular markers at the rest of the positions. These high-polished markers, like the hands, are generously filled with glow-in-the-dark, chromolite blue luminescent paint. Chromolite has been a part of most of the watches in the Rolex lineup for quite some time now, and it's one of my favorite types of lume, both for legibility and for its long-lasting duration. The dial printing is in some ways unremarkable. There's no applied logo like you'd find on other watches, and some would complain that the 4 lines of text on the lower side of the dial are too crowded and cluttered. But I'm a fan of this dial and everything on it, and that includes the simple printed details. Now, new for this model is the small crown logo between the words Swiss and Made at the bottom of the dial, and it's a small touch that differentiates it from its predecessor. Then, of course, you have the other divisive feature of this watch, and that's the date complication, or more specifically, the 2.5 times Cyclops magnifier over the date. Now, it's a feature that I personally really like, and it's one of the reasons why I chose to buy my Submariner. But there's always the no date standard Submariner for people that find the date magnifier to be a complete deal killer. I have looked over this watch for any obvious and glaring flaws like bezel misalignments or having poor print quality on the dial or issues with the rehaut and the rest of the somewhat common quality control issues that you can find on Rolex watches. And at least with the naked eye, I haven't found anything to complain about in this regards. And I have seen these types of issues with other Rolex watches, including my own. But without breaking out a magnifying glass or a jeweler's loupe, I haven't noticed any of those issues on this watch. Probably the last 2 things to talk about before we compare this watch to my prior generation model is the brushed and polished finishing of the case on the bracelet and the bracelet functionality. The brushed surfaces on the watch case and the bracelet are done to the same quality level as the watches that came before it, which is to say that the brushed finishes are well done. The high polished case flanks of the case are again in meeting with my expectations in that they are high polished and mirrored surfaces like you'd come to expect from a Rolex brand timepiece. Now the bracelet itself has polished edges on the links, and the clasp is polished on the edges as well, and the links taper down to the clasp significantly. Now this tends to be another love it or hate it feature. Some people, they prefer a bracelet with little to no taper. Others like something more like this, and it's subjective. But for me, I've had watches with both, and I don't have a strong preference either way, though I do think that these Rolex bracelets wear nicely on the wrist. The folding Oyster safety lock clasp with its glide lock extension is, in my opinion, the best clasp on the market, at least as far as I've seen and used. The clasp locks up tightly and it feels secure, but it gives you the flexibility to resize it on the fly without tools in 2mm increments with 20 total millimeters of range. It makes for a wearing experience that always gives you the perfect fit. And of course, for the folks out there that scuba dive, gives you the ability to expand the bracelet for a fit over a wetsuit if that's something you need. But in terms of general fit and adjustability, which is how the vast majority of people will use it, it really makes it nice to be able to quickly let it in or out a couple of millimeters at a time when the need calls for it. And this brings us to the part of the video where we discuss and compare this watch to the older super-cased Submariner reference 116610. And at a quick glance, they aren't too different. If you saw someone wearing one on the street, you might not even know which one they have on, unless you got a little bit too close to the person and invaded their personal space. But look at them up close and side by side like this, and there is a noticeable difference between these two watches. The first thing I noticed is obviously the case, and more specifically the lug profile. The current model has much slimmer lugs with much more elegant lines. It's much more reminiscent of the 5-digit pre-ceramic model Submariners, and I think that it was a good move to go in this direction. It does look better than the older Super case. But that does come at a cost. This watch is bigger. It's 41mm versus the older 40mm case. And there's actually two things that I want to say about that. First, yes, 1mm isn't much, but also second, I've seen a lot of people say that they wear exactly the same on the wrist, but I disagree. The new model does wear a little bit bigger, and I think the main reason isn't necessarily the case size, it's the wider bracelet. The new bracelet is 21mm wide at the watch case, and it tapers down to 16mm wide with an 18.5mm wide clasp. Now, the older model is 20mm at the case, and it tapers down to 15 with a 17mm wide clasp. This is what primarily gives the new model a heavier stance on the wrist, in my opinion. Some will say that it is proportionally better in the way that it looks, and I would agree with that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't also have a larger presence on the wrist. Another small difference that I noticed, and it took me a few minutes to pick up on it, is that the bezel on the newer watch is a hair bigger. See, as I sat here looking at these two watches side by side, something didn't look exactly the same. So I pulled out my calipers and I measured the bezels. The old model has a bezel exactly 40mm in diameter, and the newer model about a 0.5 millimeter larger. And granted, a 0.5 millimeter isn't a big deal, but it was enough that my eye noticed that inconsistency between the two. And it also leads to an ever so slightly larger presentation on the wrist. So the moral of the story is that I do disagree with all of the comments I've seen in other videos suggesting that these two watches wear exactly the same. In my experience, the new 41mm model does wear ever so slightly bigger than the older model with more wrist presence. But so too are the proportions better and the overall flow of the design more aesthetically pleasing. Now, I guess you could say the other big difference with the new model watch is the 32-35 movement. And in one sense, yes, it is a big deal. There's a lot of changes between this new movement and the 31-35. But in another sense, at least in my opinion, it's just not that big of a deal. The older 31-35 movement was a great workhorse movement that's been around since the late 1980s. And in terms of the specs that matter to me, that is, how well does the watch keep time, both of these movements are pretty much the same. They're both superlative chronometers, rated for an accuracy range of plus or minus 2 seconds per day. Now, the new movement does have the 70-hour power reserve, but honestly, that just doesn't matter too much. The 48-hour power reserve on the 3135 was plenty. Aside from that, yes, I acknowledge that the 3200 series has the new Chronergy escapement, an updated automatic winding rotor on ball bearings, and about 90% new parts overall. But again, if I'm being honest, I just really don't care. I liked the old movement just fine. So, other than a few small changes to the size and proportions of the case and the bracelet, and the new updated movement, these watches are still very similar. They both have the same great bezel and crown action, the same classic Rolex Submariner dial under the sapphire crystal, and pretty much all of the same great features, functionality, specifications, and quality. Overall, I do really like them both a lot, and while I'd love to have this new one, I'm not at all disappointed with owning the old one either. So it has been nothing but amazing having had the time here to check out this new Rolex Submariner, and again, I have to thank my friends from the watch dealer David SW for loaning me this watch for the video. Without them, it could have been years before I had gotten the chance to get my hands on one and to do this video. So thanks again, guys, I really appreciate it. Now, what are my final thoughts on this watch after having a bit of time to check it out in person? And do I want to replace my old previous generation supercased Submariner with this new one? Well, let's talk about that and some of the pros and cons. So if you don't own a Submariner, or if you're like me and you have one of the previous generation Submariners, or perhaps even an older pre-ceramic Submariner, you might be asking the question, is the new version worth getting? Well, that's a bit of a tough one. The answer kind of has two parts. First, suppose I didn't already own a prior generation Submariner. I was able to find 12610 for a good price. Then the answer is unequivocally, yes, I would certainly get it. Now, considering that I already own one of the last generation models, am I going to sell mine and pursue getting this new one? Well, no, probably not anytime soon. See, I'm still quite happy with the one that I have, but if and when the hype dies down, probably years from now, I do think that I will probably try to get one in my collection. Yeah, I do like it. Overall, I do think that the changes that they've made resulted in a slightly better watch, at least in terms of the aesthetics and the design. As for the other pros and cons of the watch, I don't know, aside from it being a bit better looking, it doesn't really have many pros over the previous model. I suppose the new movement is a bit of a pro, at least on paper, with its longer power reserve and all the new features, but that's really not much of a factor worth considering for me. I'm perfectly happy with the older 3135 movement. And aside from those things, all of the good things about the Submariner are still in place, and you either already liked the watch or you didn't like it. Similarly, there really aren't too many cons to speak of with the new Submariner. Any negatives that I might have mentioned about the watch probably would revolve around the price and the availability and the difficulty of getting one at retail, at least as it stands in June of 2021. Obviously, if money isn't a factor, you can pick one up anytime you want, but it will be at a premium above the suggested retail price. Otherwise, you need to have a good relationship with an authorized dealer, or you might be waiting a really long time. Other than that issue, I mean, what else can I say? The watch might present ever so slightly larger on the wrist, mainly because of the upsizing of the bracelet, but it's both very subtle and might not be a con at all from one person to the next. Now, I myself would have liked the watch to present smaller than the previous version, just because I favor smaller watches in general. But it doesn't look too much different on the wrist. It is a little bit bigger than the previous version on the wrist, but it's hard to tell, and it's hard to call that a con at all, really. At least from my perspective, it is pretty minor. I guess in closing, what I'm going to say about the new Submariner is that I think it's really a very nice evolution of a watch that's been evolving for years and years. And it's certainly not what I would call a revolution. There's no drastic changes, and in some ways I could even be looking at it as if it's a bit of a step back, being more in line with the overall style and shape of the pre-ceramic Submariners. But the changes that they put in place on this model, they're great choices, and I'm both really happy with how this watch turned out, and I'm still a big fan of the Submariner, as much so as I've ever been. Alright guys, as always, thanks for tuning in and watching the show. I hope you enjoyed this presentation of the new Rolex Submariner Date, reference number 126610LN. And let me say once again, thank you to David SW for loaning the watch for the video. If you guys are looking to make your next luxury watch purchase, check out the website davidsw.com, or you can give a member of the DSW team a call. I really can't recommend them enough. Now with that said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this one up for today, so until the next one, bye now.